right now, let's do a little refresher course in case it's been a minute since you thought about betting on football. But the time is approaching, my friends. Before you know it, we're going to have a whole slate of football games to bet on. You're going to have the red zone on. You're going to have a nice pumpkin beer in your hand. Ooh, I got to, get back in the real world for a second because you kind of lost me for a second when I was thinking about pumpkin beers. But Jenks, switching the mindset from betting on moneyline sports to betting on spread sports can be a little tough. So let's talk about how do you get out of the mindset of betting on those moneyline sports? What do you think is the biggest difference between betting on baseball and betting on football?
I think the biggest difference is that a single player in baseball can absolutely make the difference. And I understand that in football, you can have one guy who can ball out, but particularly in baseball, and particularly when it comes to pitching, you can have a singular player who can revert back to his early season form or a guy who performs better than you anticipate. Let me give you an example. Let's say Hunter Green for the Reds is maybe a good example. He's a young guy. I think his ERA is over 5, strikes out a lot of guys. So generally, you might want to fade him because he's a guy that gives up a lot of runs, but he certainly has that potential, even for a really bad team, to come out and have a great performance because he has so much talent and will probably get better over time. So you would probably, in most every single circumstance, fade the Reds, fade the Reds, fade the Reds. But there is a possibility that a guy like that on his own could beat a good team based on his performance. And sometimes that happens in baseball much more often than it happens in football.
I think for is in baseball, you really have to look at the prices because it's a money line sport. You're not talking about a spread unless you're talking about a run line bet where a team has to win by at least 2 runs. But you really have to pay attention to the juice. And in football, it's not so much of that. You're paying attention to the spread and those key numbers of 3, 6, 7, and maybe 10. Even though I have seen over the course of the past 10 years, 5 is actually a key number in football. So in football, you are looking at key numbers, and you are also looking at teams that, hey, yeah, they're good teams, but sometimes they're not necessarily that great at covering the spread. So a couple examples: last season, the LA Rams, of course, won the Super Bowl. They were 16-5 overall, but just 10-11 against the spread. And sometimes you'll see this with teams who have great defenses that sometimes play in these low scoring affairs. Yeah, they'll win games, but they're not covering these huge spreads. And the other example that I think is a good one is Tampa Bay on the road. They were an excellent team at home last season, 7-3 against the number, but just 3-6 against the spread when playing away from Tampa Bay. So I think in football, you are looking at teams who sometimes are really good, but they're not as good at covering the number. It is a different mindset. It's something that you kind of have to get back in the groove of. And that's what I'm trying to do right now because I am so laser focused on baseball that you are looking for sneaky underdogs and maybe some ways to get plus money on your card, as opposed to football where you're playing a spread and a number and making sure it's on a key number and you're getting the most value out of the spread.
And I think another thing to look at when you're talking about the differences between the two sports is that you can really, really get in the weeds and look at more statistics in baseball than football. We know there is no sport on the planet that is more statistically oriented than the sport of baseball. So you can approach looking into your bets, analyzing your bets, looking at metrics, looking at numbers in so many different ways. So you can make very, very specific bets based on very specific statistics that you don't generally find in any other sport. So whenever I read analysis from experts or sharps every now and then, and they're talking about baseball, sometimes they are so into some of these stats and what they mean, I have to look up what the definitions are because that baseball is just very statistically oriented. And that's how GMs have started to make decisions. As we know, that's what the whole movie Moneyball was based on. So that's another thing that generally you don't have to, you can, but you don't have the plethora of information in front of you in football as opposed to baseball.
Football seems more about matchups to me. And occasionally you will see this in baseball where the numbers and the lines are based on those stats. But occasionally you'll have an outlier where, say, this team is really good against hitting lefties. And that's where you kind of make some money, is some of those matchups that are outliers and aren't built into the number. But in football, I think matchups are way more important because you can be the greatest team on earth, but we have seen teams who really struggle against certain teams. Tom Brady doesn't have a good track record against the New Orleans Saints. He doesn't have a good track record when he has to play in Miami. So I think those are other things that come into consideration when you're betting on football, as opposed to just, hey, here are the numbers. This is a great offensive team on paper. This team isn't. So you take the better team on paper because a lot of it is matchups.
For sure. And I also think there's something about football and hockey to maybe a lesser degree about the physicality of the sport that you really can't quantify. Because being physical and being a dominant team athletically, yeah, you can kind of work that into the numbers, but it's hard to sort of say, well, this is a more physical team and they may be more motivated. And motivation is another thing too, Chelsea, because when you're talking about baseball, you're talking about 162 games a year. When you're talking about football, it is one game a week. It's a violent sport. It's a physical sport. And I think the physicality and motivation is more of a factor in football than it is in baseball because every single game means a little bit more. And again, it's hard to put that in the number. Sometimes you have to take that into consideration, but it's hard to quantify it.
It's definitely way more important in football. And that's why situational spots are another
Yep.
profitable angle
Oh,
night football, and they have an extra day of rest. Or I just
oh, Chelsea, you were so close. I heard that pop and I thought, I bet she's about to fade. And she faded out. But she was talking about situational spots. And the reason why that's so important is that situationally, you don't find a lot of those spots. You do find them in baseball, but you don't find them nearly as much in football because of things like a short week, for example. And Chelsea, I see you're back now, but we're talking about situational spots. And another thing to take into consideration, sort of along those same lines, is in football, because it is such a situational sport, if you have a team coming off a short week, and we see this all the time in football where a team played on Sunday, then they have to get ready for a game on Thursday night. And that's a situational spot where maybe you have a team coming off a bye week, a team on a short week, and you have to take those things into consideration. That happens much less often in baseball.
all right, so let's break up the segment just a bit because right now we're doing a refresher course on how to bet on football as opposed to baseball. But Jinx, I just want your opinion, and this doesn't have to be rooted in logic or anything. What do you think's harder? Do you think it's harder to bet on baseball daily, or do you think it's harder to bet on the NFL?
I think it's a lot harder to bet on the NFL, honestly, which is weird for me because I never really got into baseball betting until I started doing this show. But I feel like it's easier to find angles in baseball. It's easier to find dogs in baseball. And there are so many more different bets you can make, whether it's a prop bet, strikeout prop, hit prop, whatever it is. I think you have more options in baseball. And so, because of that, if you look hard enough, you can say, okay, there's the value I'm looking for. Betting on the NFL, betting in college, those are very difficult things to do because, and I think it's because, like we were talking about before, because of the information available. But I find that baseball is, now it's all relative, is a bit easier than football. What about you?
Right. Bottom line, betting on anything is difficult. The
Yes.
odds makers are extremely good at their jobs, but think about the sport that people bet on the most. Think about where the most money and the most handle is coming in on. It's the NFL. So these are the sharpest lines. And I think the problem is so many people think they know about football, and you can know a ton about the NFL and not be a good bettor. So I think the books kind of use that false sense of confidence against people, but these lines are the sharpest of any sport because they're getting the most handle. So the sports books are directing most of their energy, time, and attention to setting these lines. And you'll watch these games week in and week out. A lot of these lines are razor sharp.
I think that's an exceptional point and probably the best point made in this segment, which is the more people bet on something, the sharper Vegas is. And I'm going to bet on the WNBA as my best bet. Now, will that win? I don't know. But what I do know is because so much less money goes into the WNBA, so fewer bettors bet on the WNBA compared to the NFL, the Vegas isn't nearly worried about making the lines as sharp in the WNBA as they are in college football and in the NFL, just by virtue of the fact that so much more money is riding on football. So you will have a lot of bettors tell you, hey, if you want to make some real money, bet on the WNBA, bet on tennis, bet on a sport that isn't necessarily super popular, because you will find more value there than you will in the NFL or in NCAA football, whatever it is. Because if there's a lot of money on the line, you can damn well be sure that Vegas is going to be super, super sharp with the numbers they put out there.
I'll say this as a qualifier statement too, though. Betting on anything is difficult. So even if
Yes.
it's something that's in the woods, they are putting some time and attention on it. But here's my best advice. If there's a sport that you follow that's not necessarily a major sport, that's probably the best sport that you can bet on, because it is something that you are knowledgeable on. And plus, the books aren't spending as much time and attention on it. For basketball, for me in college, I'll look at conferences like the MAC,
Yeah.
like the ASUN or the Missouri Valley Conference, just because if you hone in on those, and that's another thing, if you narrow the field down to just a few teams, because maybe that's the way to go in the NFL, is trying to look at just a few teams and being really knowledgeable and really sharp on that team as a whole, as the props on that team, and kind of seeing how the players are performing week to week. Maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. We'll see as this NFL season unfolds. But bottom line, betting on anything is tough, but betting on the NFL is the most tough of any sport.
For sure. And when you talk about, hey, you have an advantage if you bet on another sport, again, we're talking about a smaller advantage than most. It's never a wide swath, because Vegas is so good at that. We're talking about, oh, maybe you have a 2% advantage here. So whatever that advantage is, it's very, very small, because Vegas is good at everything. It's just trying to find value wherever you can find it. Before we get out of this segment, how much influence or how much credence do you give to the eye test?
The eye test. What do you mean? In
Well, when you
football?
just, or in any sport, just watching something as opposed to looking at the numbers, you say, but also based on what I've seen, this is what I'm going to take into effect when I think about placing my bet.
I think you can definitely find some edges if you actually watch the games and you're seeing things you won't see in the box score. But I think it's a good combination of both, because sometimes your eyes can deceive you and you think, this team's better than you think, but you look at their against the spread record and you're like, oh, maybe not. So I think the best formula is combining both of those and using those to your advantage.